Muna's story is a powerful reminder that silence can often be the greatest weapon of those who prey on the vulnerable. But through courage, friendship, and the determination of a community, justice can prevail.
Muna Okoro was the pride of her family. At just 15 years old, she was not only disciplined, but also exceptionally bright, with dreams of becoming a doctor. Her parents, Mrs. Okoro and Mr. Okoro, worked tirelessly to provide her with a good education, often sacrificing their comfort to pay for her school needs. Every morning, Muna walked through the school gates in her neatly pressed white shirt, navy blue skirt, and polished black shoes, ready to face the day with optimism. But this term was different. Muna began to feel a sense of unease whenever she saw her mathematics teacher, Mr. Flex. He was a tall man in his late 30s, known for his strict demeanor and ability to make complex topics understandable. Many students admired him for his teaching skills, and parents trusted him implicitly. However, there was something about his lingering gaze and overly familiar tone when he addressed Muna that unsettled her. One morning, as Muna walked past the staff room, she heard Mr. Flex call her name. "Muna, see me during break," he said, adjusting his glasses and smiling in a way that made her stomach churn. She nodded politely, unsure why he wanted to see her. She was an excellent student who rarely got into trouble, so there was no reason for concern. At least, that's what she told herself. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Muna couldn't concentrate during her lessons, her mind racing with questions. What could Mr. Flex want from her? Was there a mistake in her assignments? When the bell rang for break, Muna reluctantly made her way to the staff room. Knocking softly on the door, she heard his voice. "Come in." The room was quiet, most of the other teachers having left for their break. Mr. Flex was seated behind his desk, his light blue shirt neatly ironed and his glasses perched low on his nose. He gestured for her to sit down. "You're one of the brightest students in this school," he began, leaning forward slightly. "I see great potential in you." "Thank you, sir," Muna replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He continued, his tone soft but unnerving. "Bright students like you need guidance, someone to ensure they reach their full potential." Muna shifted uncomfortably in her seat. There was something off about the way he spoke, but she couldn't quite place it. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, unsure of what else to add. "Good," he said, his smile widening. "You'll stay after school today. I want to help you with some advanced mathematics. It's important for someone like you to stay ahead." Muna hesitated. She had never stayed back after school without informing her parents. "Sir, I'll need to ask my parents first." "No need," he interrupted, his voice firm. "This is about your future. I'll explain everything if necessary." The finality in his tone silenced her. She nodded reluctantly, feeling a growing sense of dread. That evening, Muna stayed back as instructed. Mr. Flex was alone in the classroom, waiting for her. The session began innocuously enough with him explaining advanced concepts and giving her problems to solve. But as the minutes passed, his demeanor changed. He leaned too close, his tone overly familiar. Muna felt trapped, unsure of how to respond without seeming disrespectful. When she finally left the classroom, her heart was racing, her palms sweaty. She didn't tell her parents what had happened that day, brushing off their questions about why she was late. She convinced herself that she was overreacting, that Mr. Flex only wanted to help her succeed. But the unease lingered, growing stronger each time he called her name. The once safe space of her school began to feel suffocating, and Muna's bright eyes started to dull. Unbeknownst to Muna, this was only the beginning of a dark chapter in her life. Mr. Flex's interest in her was far from innocent, and her silence would only deepen his control. Muna Okoro's transformation didn't go unnoticed by her best friend, Bridget Ease. The once cheerful and ambitious Muna had become withdrawn, her bright smile now a rare sight. Bridget, with her bubbly personality and sharp intuition, had always been the kind of friend who paid attention to the little things. Muna's behavior worried her deeply. It wasn't just the quietness that unsettled Bridget, it was the fear she saw in Muna's eyes. Muna, who once eagerly discussed her dream of becoming a doctor, now avoided conversations altogether. She rarely joined Bridget during break times, and often seemed distracted during lessons. One day, during a particularly dull history class, Bridget leaned over and whispered, "Muna, are you okay? You've been so distant lately." Muna shook her head quickly, not meeting her friend's gaze. "I'm fine," she whispered back, her voice shaky. But Bridget wasn't convinced. Later that day, as they sat together under the mango tree during break, Bridget pressed her again. "Something's wrong, Muna. You're not yourself anymore. Did someone say something to you?" Muna hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her navy blue skirt. "I'm just tired," she muttered, avoiding Bridget's questioning eyes. "Tired of what?" Bridget asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "You've been acting strange for weeks now. If something's wrong, you need to tell me. I'm your friend, Muna." Muna looked up briefly, her eyes filled with fear. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly. Bridget's heart sank. She didn't know what was going on, but she was determined to find out. Over the next few days, she began paying closer attention to Muna's interactions, especially with Mr. Flex. It didn't take long for Bridget to notice a disturbing pattern. Mr. Flex seemed to be watching Muna constantly. He called her out of class during break times, always finding reasons to keep her alone. Each time Muna returned, she looked more withdrawn than before. Bridget's concern turned to alarm one afternoon when she saw Muna leaving the classroom with Mr. Flex. She waited a few minutes and then followed them discreetly, staying out of sight. From a distance, she saw them enter the staff room. Peeking through the slightly ajar door, Bridget's heart raced as she saw Mr. Flex standing too close to Muna, speaking in a low voice. Muna's body language screamed discomfort. She kept her head down, her hands clutching her books tightly. Bridget stepped back, her mind racing. What was Mr. Flex doing, and why was Muna so scared? She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right. The next morning, Bridget made a decision. During break time, she approached their form teacher, Mrs. Femi. "Ma, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Femi looked up from her desk, sensing the urgency in Bridget's tone. "What is it, Bridget?" "It's about Muna and Mr. Flex," Bridget began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I think something is going on. He's always calling her out during break, and she's been acting really scared. I don't know what, but I know it's not right." Mrs. Femi's expression turned serious. "Thank you for telling me, Bridget. I'll look into it immediately." Bridget felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was certain she had taken the first step in helping her friend. Unbeknownst to Muna, Bridget's determination to protect her would soon set off a chain of events that would expose the truth. Bridget Eze felt a heavy weight of responsibility after confiding in Mrs. Femi about her suspicions. She couldn't shake the image of Muna's fearful eyes or the sight of Mr. Flex standing too close to her friend. Mrs. Femi, known for her empathy and attentiveness, wasted no time in taking action. She began observing Mr. Flex's behavior closely, paying attention to how he interacted with Muna. It didn't take long for Mrs. Femi to notice troubling patterns. Mr. Flex frequently called Muna out during break times and seemed to hover around her more than any other student. Muna, in turn, looked visibly uncomfortable in his presence, her shoulders tense, her gaze fixed on the floor. Mrs. Femi's suspicions grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, she called Bridget to her desk. "Bridget, thank you for speaking up about Muna. I've been watching, and I agree that something isn't right," she said. "What can we do, Ma?" Bridget asked, her voice laced with urgency. "We need proof," Mrs. Femi said thoughtfully. "If we're going to confront Mr. Flex and protect Muna, we need undeniable evidence of his behavior." Bridget nodded, though the idea of gathering proof made her nervous. "I'll do whatever it takes to help her, Ma," she said firmly. The next day, the plan was set into motion. Bridget kept a close eye on Muna, ready to follow her discreetly if Mr. Flex called her out. As expected, during break time, Mr. Flex approached Muna's desk. "Muna, meet me in the staff room," he said in his usual calm tone. Muna hesitated, glancing briefly at Bridget, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Muna reluctantly followed Mr. Flex out of the classroom. Bridget waited a few moments before slipping out behind them. Her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She trailed them to the staff room, careful to stay out of sight. Peering through the slightly open window, she saw Mr. Flex standing close to Muna, speaking in a low, commanding voice. "Why do you always look so scared, Muna?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You should know by now that as long as you behave, nothing bad will happen." Bridget's heart pounded as she recorded the scene on her phone. Muna stood frozen, clutching her books tightly, her body visibly trembling. Mr. Flex reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're a smart girl, Muna. Don't ruin your future by making bad decisions," he said. In an instant, his hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. Muna froze her books, falling to the floor with a thud. "Sir, what is it?" He hissed, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Don't make a sound." Her heart raced as she tried to pull away, but his grip was firm. "Sir, please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Flex's face twisted into a sinister smile. "If you tell anyone about this, Muna, I will kill you. Do you understand?" Muna's breath hitched, fear paralyzing her. She nodded slowly, unable to speak. Satisfied, he released her wrist as she stumbled. Before he could say a thing, the door suddenly swung open. "Mr. Flex," Mrs. Femi's voice rang out, filled with anger. Mr. Flex spun around, his face a mixture of shock and fear. "Mrs. Femi, what are you doing here?" he stammered, trying to compose himself. "I could ask you the same question," she said, stepping closer. "Muna, leave the room." Muna bolted out, tears streaming down her face. Outside, she ran into Bridget, who hugged her tightly. "It's over," Bridget whispered. Inside the staff room, Mr. Flex tried to defend himself. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just helping her with her work," he said. "Save your excuses," Mrs. Femi said coldly. "You'll need them for the principal." By the end of the day, the evidence Bridget had recorded, combined with Mrs. Femi's testimony, was presented to Mr. Jojo, the school principal. Shocked and appalled, he called the police. Inspector John arrived that afternoon and arrested Mr. Flex, his protests falling on deaf ears. As the news spread, the school community was shaken. For Muna, the nightmare wasn't entirely over, but she finally felt a glimmer of hope, knowing she was no longer alone. Bridget and Mrs. Femi's determination had exposed the truth and set the stage for justice to be served. The arrest of Mr. Flex sent shockwaves through the school and the community. News of his actions spread quickly, leaving parents, teachers, and students grappling with disbelief and anger. For Muna Okoro, it was a bittersweet moment. Although the nightmare of Mr. Flex's control had ended, the emotional scars he left behind were deep. Muna's parents, Mrs. Okoro and Mr. Okoro, were devastated when they learned the truth. The guilt of not noticing their daughter's struggles weighed heavily on them. "How could we have missed the signs?" Mrs. Okoro asked, her voice breaking as she held Muna tightly. "We should have asked more questions. We should have been there for you." "It's not your fault," Muna said softly, tears streaming down her face. "I was too scared to tell you. I thought he would hurt us all." Determined to support their daughter, the Okoros arranged counseling sessions to help Muna process her trauma. At first, she was hesitant to open up, but with time, the sessions became a safe space for her to express her emotions and begin her journey toward healing. Meanwhile, the school community took swift action. Principal Jojo, deeply shaken by the incident, called an emergency meeting for the staff. "We failed to protect one of our students," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "This must never happen again." Mrs. Femi took the lead in organizing workshops for teachers and staff to recognize signs of distress and create a safer environment for students. "We need to rebuild trust," she said during the first session. every student must feel safe to speak up, no matter the situation. Bridget Ease, Muna's best friend, remained a pillar of strength throughout the ordeal. "I'll always have your back, Muna," she said one afternoon as they walked home together. "You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone anymore." Bridget's unwavering support reminded Muna of the importance of having someone who listens and believes in you. The incident also sparked conversations among parents about the importance of staying involved in their children's lives. During a PTA meeting, Mrs. Okoro shared her experience. "Ask questions," she urged. "Don't assume everything is fine just because your child says so. Be present, be vigilant, and let them know they can trust you." As the weeks turned into months, Muna began to rediscover her voice. She returned to her studies with a renewed determination to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor, knowing that she had the love and support of her family and friends. The school implemented stricter policies to prevent future incidents, including regular teacher evaluations, anonymous reporting channels for students, and increased parental engagement. Muna's story became a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and open communication. It inspired a community to come together, ensuring that no child would ever have to endure such pain in silence again. While the scars of her experience would remain, Muna knew she had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life and future.
Muna's story is a powerful reminder that silence can often be the greatest weapon of those who prey on the vulnerable. But through courage, friendship, and the determination of a community, justice can prevail. This is not just a story about one girl's struggle. It is a call to all of us, parents, teachers, and communities, to pay attention, ask questions, and never turn a blind eye to a child in need. Every child deserves a safe and supportive environment to learn and grow. Let us all work together to ensure no child suffers in silence again. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and comment on this video to spread awareness. Subscribe to Paul series for more stories that educate, inspire, and empower. Together, we can make a difference.